of those ads I used to see on TV, the motor mouth, you know.
Okay, we're recording.
Okay, as a preliminary matter, this is Gary Bella, Chair of the Advisory Committee for Non-Voting Taxpayers. Permit me to confirm that all members and persons anticipated on the agenda are present and can hear me. Members, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Lou Bassano.
Here.
Bill Gardner.
Here.
Peter Howe.
Here.
Peter Kahn.
Here.
Kathy Baird.
Here.
Bill Sherman.
Here.
Don Green.
Here.
Gary Bella. So we're all here. Great. Nice to have you there. Don, your video isn't on yet, but
Okay.
let me continue with the script.
Here we go.
Okay. I also anticipated speakers on the agenda. We're delighted to have Denice Kronau and Brian Turbitt with us. You're both here, right? Yep.
Present.
Thank you.
Here.
This open meeting of the Advisory Committee for Non-Voting Taxpayers is being conducted remotely, consistent with Governor Baker's executive order of March 12, 2020, due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth due to the outbreak of COVID-19 virus. In order to mitigate the transmission of the COVID-19 virus, we have been advised and directed by the Commonwealth to suspend public gatherings, and as such, the governor's order suspends the requirement of the open meeting law to have all meetings in a publicly accessible physical location. Further, all members of public bodies are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely. The order, which you can find posted with agenda materials for this meeting, allows public bodies to meet entirely remotely so long as reasonable public access is afforded so that the public can follow along with the deliberations of the meeting. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. This meeting may feature public comment. For this meeting, the ACNVT is convening by video conference via Zoom app as posted on the town's website, identifying how the public may join. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and that all attendees are participating by video conference. Accordingly, please be aware that other folks may be able to see you and to take care not to screen share your computer. Anything that you broadcast may be captured by the recording. All supporting materials that have been provided members of this body are available on the town's website unless otherwise noted. The public is encouraged to follow along using the posted agenda. We are now turning to the first item on the agenda. Before we do so, permit me to cover some ground rules for effective and clear conduct of our business and to ensure accurate meeting minutes. The chair will introduce each speaker on the agenda. After they conclude the remarks, the chair will go down the line of members, inviting each by name to provide any comment, questions, or motions. Please hold until your name is called. Please remember to mute your phone or computer when you're not speaking. Please remember to speak clearly. For any response, please wait until the chair yields the floor to you. If members wish to engage in a conversation with other members, please do so through the chair. And for items with public comment, the chair will afford public comment to those members of the public that have joined the meeting via Zoom. And finally, each vote taken in this meeting will be conducted by roll call vote. So that's the notification that we all have now. And I don't see any members of the public joining us today. So let's proceed. The first to look at the agenda, you all have received copies of the agenda. Does anyone have any changes to the agenda, or do we have a motion? Someone want to make a motion to approve the agenda?
Motion to approve.
Second?
Second.
Okay, and all in favor? Lou Bassano?
Yes.
Peter?
Yes.
Says yes. Peter Kahn? Bill
Yes.
Gardner?
Yes.
And Kathy says yes, and I say yes. Okay, thank you.
And Don says yes.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry, Don. Thank you. Okay, so we have the agenda approved. Next item would be approval of the minutes. Kathy sent out the minutes. Does anybody have any changes or comments to the minutes from our last meeting?
I had to fix the date. I had written August 20th as the date, and someone pointed out it was the 22nd, so I have fixed that. That's the only change to what I sent out.
Okay, any other change, or do we have a motion to approve?
Motion to approve.
Approve as corrected.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Let me go through the names again. Kathy, yes. Lou Bassano?
Yes.
Peter?
Yes.
Don?
Yes.
Peter? Bill?
Yes.
Yes.
And Gary, yep, okay. That's great, folks. We're moving along nicely. So we are lucky today to have two terrific guests who are joining us, Denice Kronau and Brian Turbitt, who are both eminently qualified to tell us about the finances of the town of Nantucket. And I have sent them, as you all know, because I sent you copies of the notes that I sent them, some thoughts that we'd like to hear, just a big picture about our budget. And then each, Brian and Denice can talk a little bit about their view of the town's finances at this particular time. And then, of course, when our members have questions, we'll be glad to ask questions. Let me, I guess I think we should first allow Denice and Brian to speak to us first, a little bit of overview about the budget, and in which you may want to respond to some of the questions that I've raised. If not, we can cover those later on. But I just want to make one point to Denice and Brian, and that is sometimes I feel like our committee is the Rodney Dangerfield of the committees. You know, remember Rodney Dangerfield? He always used to say, he don't get no respect. That's the old Rodney Dangerfield. And so when I think about our committee, and we've talked about this over the years, we, the non-voting taxpayers of Nantucket, provide the lion's share of the funding for the entire island. And notwithstanding that, there are limited opportunities for us to get our points of view across to the town. We've never been allowed to speak at annual town meetings. We have no voting rights. And the select board was wise enough years ago to put together this committee so we could provide some input. But it seems to me that it's a quest that we are continuing to be on, which is to make sure that the voices of the non-resident taxpayers, which provide such a substantial portion of the funding of the entire island, it's important that our views are taken into consideration, and sometimes we think they may not be. Anyway, with that, I'll turn it over to Denice and Brian. You guys can figure out how you'd like to talk to us about the budget, basically. Okay?
Sure.
Thank you, Gary. Brian, I think I'm just going to start with what FinCom does, and then I will turn it over to you to go through the specifics that I know the committee is very interested in hearing about, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so I'm sure you're all aware, but just to reinforce, the Finance Committee is an advisory board to the Select Board and the town of Nantucket. We are 9 members. We are appointed for 3-year terms each by the Select Board. And our role is to thoroughly investigate all the warrant articles. So every article that's put in the warrant that's reviewed and voted on at town meeting, we review, we discuss with the sponsors, and then we make a motion as to whether it should be motion to adopt, motion to take no action, or motion not to adopt. Those are our 3 rulings that we would, or not rulings, but those are the 3 motions that we make. We investigate any expenditures by the town, as in when we think we need to go into a deep dive on those. We act as the capital committee if the town didn't have a capital committee, but we do. We have a very active and proactive capital committee, so we work together jointly with them to look at the capital spending. Our role is to approve any unforeseen major expenditures as and when that occurs. Sorry, I've got 2 dogs that are going to be defending this house violently, sorry. And then we're also the Nantucket County Review, and together they weigh 25 pounds put together. So, you know, that's why they sound like they do. And we're also the Nantucket County Review Committee. The majority of our work is really looking at the warrant. We spend about 65% of our time. We start in December and through March when the warrant has to be finalized for annual town meeting. We will be meeting up to 4 times a week. I personally, as chair, will spend about 20 to 30 hours a week on it, primarily because last year we had 53 citizens warrant articles, which was a significantly larger number than normal. Normally we have between 25 and 30. So we take a look at every article, we invite the sponsors in to discuss them with us, we ask questions, and then after deliberation, which sometimes can be 5 minutes, or sometimes it can be up to, you know, a couple of hours depending on the topic. We then make a motion that's then printed in the warrant, and then at the annual town meeting, that's what the voters are voting on. Do you agree with the motion made by Finance Committee? For the majority of the articles, some of them are Planning Board, but the majority of them are from Finance Committee. So we work very closely with Brian, and just to you know, Brian, you want to close your ears for this one so you don't get embarrassed, but I was the CFO for a couple of corporations, for a $20 billion corporation. I've been the CEO of corporations, and Brian is probably one of the most talented finance people I've worked with. So it is a real pleasure to work with him and his team and how they look after the finances of Nantucket. And our Moody's AAA rating is really an amazing thing to have. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Brian.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to all of you. It's always a pleasure to be able to speak to all of the various groups on the island and give them an update on not only, you know, how the town is doing, but answer any of the questions that they have and take the feedback and try to incorporate it to the extent that we can. I mean, we internally try to listen to everybody's comments or suggestions, and to the extent we can, if we can try to do something, we do. There's a lot of things that, you know, municipal government is certainly different than many different operations and how it operates. So there's certain, obviously, some restrictions and limitations on what we can and can't do and how quickly we can move. Having been in the private sector and then moving back to municipal government when I moved down to Massachusetts, I always said, you know, municipal government is always like I've always envisioned it to trying to turn an aircraft carrier on a dime. It just does not go quite as fast as people would always like, but it does get there. I think what I'll do is we're in the process of closing fiscal 20 right now. It was another really great year in terms of revenues, performed very well. We were very lucky that the majority of what I call our local estimated receipts, which makes up motor vehicle excise tax, rooms and meals taxes, interest, penalties, parking tickets, fee, and other fees like that, building permits. The majority of our local estimated receipts are primarily collected before December 31st, with the exception of motor vehicle excise tax. Motor vehicle excise tax, the largest commitment for that, which runs right around about between $1.9 and $2 million annually, is sent out in February every year. But for the most part, rooms and meals tax being anywhere between 45 to 55% of the entire pot of local estimated receipts that we collect, the majority of ours are all collected by December 31st, just because of the season that we have and the timing of those payments. So when the global pandemic hit, we were very fortunate that the majority of those types of revenues that are really where you see the majority of the fluctuations, we had primarily collected almost all of them that we would collect. The only concern that we had was really the timing of that for motor vehicle excise, but that still performed fairly well. It performed within what we had expected. We had expected to see a small decline when basically the governor issued all of his emergency orders and all work stopped. So there was a slowdown. The next area that we were a little bit concerned about was obviously property taxes. But we looked back over the last 5 or 6 years to try to get a calculation and get an estimate of where we thought it would end up. And it still performed reasonably well as compared to our expectations. So overall, on the revenue side, the town met or exceeded the expectations that we had, even with the global pandemic in fiscal 20, which ended on June 30th of 2020. Expenditures, you know, I do want to commend all of the department heads. They certainly work very diligently with us to ensure that every dollar is treated and spent on what we need to provide the services to all of the residents of the island. They did very good. They did a wonderful job of working with us as we tried to manage through not only the beginning of the year, but the pandemic. And we certainly had another strong year. And certainly we did not spend every dollar that we had been allocated in the budget, which you know, again, is a testament to the diligence and the hard work that all of the department heads put in managing the departments and the budgets that they're allocated on an annual basis. So I think overall, fiscal 20 did end very strongly. I think it will be another positive year for the town. We are in the middle of the close, and at the end of this month, we'll be having our audit. So I generally like to wait until the auditors have come through and poured over everything to ensure that we have everything correct, which I certainly believe we have based on the last 6 years that I've been here with no issues in the audit. 21 is certainly a little bit of a different animal. I don't think I've ever quite experienced anything like this in my time in this position, either here or in my prior job or prior location. As everybody knows, the annual town meeting was postponed until June. When this hit, we had to basically go back in a short, about 45 days or less, rebuild the entire budget, looking at what did we think was going to happen with revenue. I can tell you that we took about $6 million worth of revenue off the table in the budget across the way we allocate all of the revenue that we had. We had it projected for the April budget revenue of 105 million. And when we rebuilt and recast the budget for the June town meeting, we were projecting just under 100 million, about $99.5 million. We really took a very hard look at local estimated receipts, which, as I had explained, was we budgeted about $11.5 million in that particular category for fiscal 21. After the budget and the pandemic, we pared it back by over 50% in that particular category alone. Given the reliance, as I mentioned, with local options, meals, and rooms tax being two of the largest contributors to those local estimated receipts, and given that we were building this budget in April and May to try to get ready for a June town meeting, we essentially pared back rooms tax, which last year brought in over $5.2 million to $2.4 million in this year's budget, which was the original budget was about just over 4 million. We cut that back by 60%. And quite frankly, the reason that we did it was nobody really had a great idea on what the summer season was going to look like, or whether people were going to be able to travel. And if they were, was it going to be in a meaningful way? We did the same with meals tax. We actually eliminated meals tax completely from the calculation in the local estimated receipts, because again, at that point in time, we just had no idea whether restaurants were going to be open or be able to open, under what scenarios they were going to be able to open. So we eliminated, that was about $1 million in the budget that we eliminated. We had eliminated just over 1.6, almost 1.7 million in rooms tax. We significantly scaled back building permits, plumbing and wiring permits, because again, at the time that we were doing this, people were not really back to work yet, and we were just not really sure what the environment we were going to be operating was in. We scaled back state aid, because at the time we were doing this, the state was predicting up between $4 to $6 billion shortfall themselves, which in the original governor's budget, there had been an attempt to increase state aid, which we felt was most likely going to be removed as a way to deal with their potential shortfall. But having lived through reduced state aid in 2008 and 2009 in my previous job in another municipality, we also took the approach that we expected that they potentially could cut state aid as well, as a way to shore the budget up in the initial stages. So we plugged in about an $880,000 reduction in state aid. Now, I can tell you, which is a positive, is that the legislature and the governor's office have all agreed that at a minimum, state aid will be level funded at the levels that all municipalities across the Commonwealth received in 2020 for fiscal year 2020. So that actually is a very good thing. It will actually have an impact to the taxpayers, because we will not have to raise that money in the tax rate, and it will actually, when we do the recap sheet to set the tax rate, we are obligated to use the actual amount of state aid that has been obligated to the town. So that will actually reduce the amount in the levy limit that we raised by about 880,000, which is a positive in this environment. Overall, through the first 3 months, I usually give a presentation to the board in September. It's going to be a little bit more difficult to predict what's going to happen, because through the global pandemic for fiscal 21, the Commonwealth has extended the due date for rooms and meals tax reporting into October. We normally get the first payment, which is for June, July, and August, on September 30th. We will not be getting that until sometime into October. So unfortunately, my crystal ball is a little fuzzy when it comes to trying to figure out exactly what's happening with rooms and meals tax on the island. I know that it certainly looks busier and busy, probably than I had anticipated when we were building the budget, but I'm not entirely sure where that's going to end up, but it will certainly be, it will be a good indication of how close to what we had predicted was going to happen in terms of revenue. Is, are we close? Are we really far off? I'm certainly hoping that we performed a little bit better than we had anticipated, which would be good in going into fiscal 22. But so that's kind of where the general fund was. General fund was up 1.22% when we rebuilt the budget. It was originally up, I think, about 3.4%. We eliminated about $2 million, just over $2.4 million out of the general fund from the April budget to this budget. The great majority of that was the town had vacant positions in last year's budget that department heads were working to fill that we completely eliminated. We eliminated any new positions that had been requested and agreed to be funded in the budget. The school took a $500,000 reduction to their line item in the budget. And with that, we were able to make some smaller changes throughout the budget, primarily in health insurance, because as you defund or remove personnel positions, we can certainly realize the reduction in other personnel associated costs as well. So overall, I think we have created a budget that will deliver the services to the residents of the town and do it in a fiscally prudent way. And so I think that we have, given what we had to do in a very short time, I think that the town has been able to produce a budget that will continue to deliver the services that the residents have come to expect on the island. Enterprise funds, which just to give everybody a little kind of a quick primer on, enterprise funds are typically what's known as business activity funds. They generally are supposed to be self-supporting. They're usually and typically paid for through user fees. We have 6 enterprise funds on the island. We have 2 at the water company. So we have Comet Water, we have Sconset Water Company. Both of those are completely 100% funded by the user fees relative to the services that they both provide. The Nantucket Memorial Airport is an enterprise fund. Again, 100% funded by the user fees and the revenue derived at the airport. We have not had to give the airport any general fund subsidy in the entire time that I've been here. So they certainly have done a very great, Tom Rafter and his staff have done a great job in rebuilding and putting the airport on very solid footing. There is the Sewer Enterprise Fund, again, which is 100% self-supporting through the permit fees, the betterment fees, and through the user rates at the sewer department. And then the town has 2 others, which are enterprise funds because Mass General Law allows us to have them as enterprise funds. And I think it gives the residents a better understanding of what it takes to actually operate those types of entities. Although I don't know that they really should be enterprise funds because they get substantial subsidies from the tax base, the landfill being one of them, and then Our Island Home being the other one. So we have 6 entities that we have voted at town meeting many years ago to create and operate as enterprise funds. They went through the same process that we did internally with rebuilding their budgets. The water company looked at their budgets and reduced their budgets by a few $100,000 in Sconset and probably close to just under $1 million, I think it was in Comet. The airport received $6.2 million from the FAA as part of the CARES Act. So their budget, which was probably going to be one of the largest to be impacted in fiscal 21, they reduced it by about, I think it was $3.5 or $4 million. I can actually look real quick. They'd had a substantial reduction in their budget because of that $6.2 million in grant funding. The majority of their personnel costs this year and into potentially fiscal 21 will be paid for by the CARES Act. And we'll be monitoring and working with them as we start to come out of the pandemic on what their budget will look like moving forward. Solid waste didn't have any changes there. There's very limited personnel there. Most of our costs there is associated with the operations by Waste Options. In Our Island Home, there was no change there. The only change that we made to Island Home was, I know Gary, you had asked this question, you had mentioned this question in the email that you had sent. Back in, I think it was May, when we were deciding how to move forward with everything, the select board at a meeting had decided, as I'm sure everybody is aware, the town had put forth a permanent override on the ballot to fund for a $5 million override, which would be a permanent increase to the tax levy to, what I will say is to correctly fund our island home versus the way that we have been doing it in previous years. In May, the board had made a decision that if the override were to pass on the ballot, because the ballot was going to be before the annual town meeting, that we would not use the override, given the global pandemic and the conditions that everybody was facing. So I can tell you that the override did pass the ballot, but at town meeting, we funded the entire amount for Ireland Home through certified free cash of about $3.5 million from the general fund, retained earnings of $1.5 million from Ireland Home itself, which is the $5 million that would have been used if we had voted for the override at annual town meeting, and then about $3.7 million in what I'll call user fees, but patient revenue either via private pay or via insurance company payments. So I will just talk a little bit about the override if you want, Gary.
Yes.
Does that make sense? Okay.
Yep.
So since I've been here, I've been saying that I've been advising the board through the town manager and even having discussions with the FinCom that if we were going to continue to operate our island home, that we had to find a way to solidify the funding source outside of the user revenue. Every year we would at the annual town meeting ask to transfer between anywhere from $1.5 to $2.5 million of tax levy into the island home, and we would supplement that gap with their certified retained earnings. Well, one thing, our financial policies actually say that we should never use retained earnings or free cash as a funding source for a permanent operating budget because they're not stable or guaranteed funding sources on a year-over-year basis. I can't guarantee that next year I will have $2 million in retained earnings in Island Home or $3.5 million in free cash to be able to subsidize them. So we have been fluctuating and going through this, and every year we've been saying we needed to consider doing this. Island Home's certified retained earnings have been fluctuating on a year-over-year basis. They essentially are built. Their retained earnings primarily are created out of what's known as a reimbursement from the Commonwealth for the certified public expenditures we have for operating a nursing home, and we get anywhere between $1.3 to $2 million reimbursement on an annual basis from the Commonwealth. But there is no guarantee that the Commonwealth is going to continue that on a year-over-year basis. If they voted not to do it in a year, then we wouldn't get it. So given the fact that that was how retained earnings was budgeted, it certainly would potentially put more stress on the general fund operations than we typically face in a budget year. So we had decided that, as we move forward and talk about what we're going to do with the future of the island home, we decided that this year would be the year that we would put the override on the budget into the budget and ask the voters and the taxpayers to agree to allow us to go above add $5 million permanently to the levy limit. And we'll tell everybody that in the first year, the money is earmarked 100% for island home. The way that overrides are done, the second year it becomes part of the levy limit. But I will tell everybody in this meeting and everybody that's listening that internally in our budget documents, we had already set aside that $5 million every year in the future for island home. So it was not going to be just vacuumed up into the general fund and be allocated elsewhere. It was automatically in the planning documents that we have created, it was automatically set aside so that it would be set aside for what we had asked to do with it and to fund the island home correctly. Again, this year we didn't use it because we did not raise that money at the annual town meeting. We will need to go through in the future the entire process all over again. We will need to ask for approval at an annual town meeting, and we will need to ask for approval at a ballot. The authorization for the override expires if you don't raise it in the year that it was for. So we will be starting all over potentially, and I don't know what will happen with fiscal 22, but at some point I believe that we will be recommending that we consider doing this again, whether it's fiscal 22 or another fiscal year farther out. I don't know at this point, but it will come forward at at some point again. I think I'll stop and let everybody ask any questions, if that's okay, Gary.
Yes. I had a couple of big picture type questions. So on the chart that I sent you in 2019,
Yep.
the total revenue from all sources was $143 million,
Yes,
of which the tax levy was 80 million and the local receipts were 52. That was 2019.
yes.
With respect to the enterprise funds, was that in over and above the 143 million of revenue?
No, that the $143 million of revenue, which is actually direct from the recap sheet that we create to set the tax rate, is inclusive of enterprise funds. It includes everything. That's the entire budget for everything that we appropriate at town meeting, be from special revenue funds, anywhere we appropriate it from is inclusive in that 143 million.
Okay. And I had questions with respect to the tax levy generally. In 2019, it was $80 million. And the calculation, what I did is I called the town assessor's office, tax assessor, and based on, I asked them, what are the taxes that are paid by the non-residents and what are the taxes that are paid by the residents? And basically, what they told me was that they issue 9,000 tax bills a year. This is real estate taxes.
Correct.
And approximately 2,500 are to the residents.
Sure.
And therefore, they get a 25% discount, which I concluded cost town about $6.8 million in 2019. And then the balance is paid by, I say us, the non-resident taxpayers. What I concluded from running the numbers, looking at the actual taxes themselves, which were in one of those charts that I had in the report, was that it turns out that the amount of tax bills that are sent to the non-residents like us is 72% of the total tax bills go to the non-residents and 28% go to the residents. But as far as the actual taxes collected, 88% of the taxes collected are from the non-residents and only 12% of those totals come from the residents. And that was confirmed to me by the tax department. So which is the kind of discussion when we've had with members of the town, whether it's select board or others, we say, you know, we pay most of the taxes, and they say yes, and how much is that? And sometimes they say 85%. So the number on real estate seems closer to me, like 88%. With respect to local receipts, in 2019 it was $50 million, 52 million in 2019.
Yeah, so the 52 million that's classified, so what you were looking at is the at a glance in the town report, so which kind of gives a synopsis of some of the financial information. The local receipts, the 52 million is actually is about just under 10.5 million is local receipts in the general fund, which I talked about being motor vehicle excise, rooms and meals. The remaining roughly 42 million is all the revenues from the enterprise funds that they're just categorized as local receipts here. When we build the way that the Commonwealth, when you set the tax rate, it does is it takes the entire appropriations across everything, adds them up, which is the 143 million. Okay. And then you identify every other source of revenue that you have other than property taxes. So you take the local estimated receipts that we build into the general fund budget. You take any other funding sources, ambulance reserve, waterways improvements, any other special revenue funds that we allocate at annual town meeting, ferry embarkation fees. You add up all of those become what are known as local estimated receipts. You add the state aid, which in 19 was $3.8 million. And then other available is free cash allocation and certified retained earnings calculations that get done. You add up all of those, subtract that from the 143, and that becomes what we're raising and appropriating the tax rate to fund everything. I will tell you that in fiscal 20, we raised and appropriated through the tax levy just under $85 million. It was about $84.6 million that was raised. So that number changed, which will be in the next annual town report that is put out.
And is there any way to figure out what % of that might be might be the part paid by the non-resident taxpayers?
Absolutely. The assessor's office has it internally that we look at all the time. I can tell you that we look at this information all the time, and that number changes on an annual basis. And everybody always asks, what is the split? So the assessor's office does keep a year-over-year review of that.
Okay.
And I'll be happy when we set the tax rate for, well, I'll be happy we can do it for 20, and I'll include it. But when we set the tax rate for fiscal 21, I'll be happy to send you all of this information so you can distribute it to your committee, and we'll include that breakdown for you.
Thank you. I have one quick question for Denise. Denise, when the Finance Committee meets, and when you and I chatted a few days ago, you said you take into consideration all taxpayers' concerns, right? Not just residents.
Absolutely.
My question is, how do you know what our concerns are? No one has asked our committee anything in the last 6 years, at least, that I've been on the committee here. So how do you feel the views of the non-resident taxpayers gets incorporated into the thinking of the Finance Committee?
Thank you, Gary. Whilst we haven't had a formal mechanism up until now to get the views of this committee. Number one, I, up until recently, was also a non-resident taxpayer until just a few years ago. So I lived and breathed the position of everyone on this committee for 18 years prior to becoming a resident. Secondly, the Finance Committee is really made up of a very broad population of people, and we all have friends, neighbors, etc., who are non-residents. So, I'm more than happy to attend more of your meetings as a member of the public to listen to your discussions. That's really how, or to ask one of my Finance Committee members to do it. But I think because we're all very integrated into this community, and it's integrated into the whole community, obviously not just the people who are here year-round. So I think that there's an opportunity potentially for us to be a bit more formally connected. And at the same time, trust me, I don't think there's anyone on our committee who wouldn't have had information or input or discussions with folks who are not residents and are still taxpayers. And as you and I chatted about on the phone, one of the things that I was saying to Gary, I ran an organization one time where we built up our capacities for processing business in India, and we grew the business from 25 people to 400 people. And my general manager there used to call me every day and say, Denise, I'm sitting on the cash box. I'm like, okay, Nagu, I'm glad you're sitting on the cash box, meaning he was watching the expenses, to the rupee. And one of the things that we consider as the Finance Committee is that when you take a look at particularly the taxpayers, are we absolutely making sure that, working together collaboratively, obviously with Brian and his team and all the town administration, that the money is being spent appropriately, so we are always asking questions. We are always, we're very engaged in the discussion. So we take seriously that our role is to advise the town on the most prudent spending and of tax money. And I have to say, and I've been now 3.5 years on Finance Committee, and I will say that the town is very, very diligent about spending money. We do an annual budget review with all the town departments. It's a nearly all day review on a Saturday. We sit down and go through every budget line by line. We really do watch that the town is really prudent about its spending. And as Brian had said earlier, when the pandemic hit, I don't know how many discussions Brian and I have had since March about reviewing budgets, what's going to happen, where can we cut costs. They were very diligent about how do we take costs down immediately, and understanding that the town has some complexity and limitations because it is a municipality. There's a lot of unions here. So all that stuff adds into it. But I think I'm kind of going on and on, so I'll stop talking and let you ask another question.
It's just that we always feel that when the town meetings occur, they either occur when the non-voting taxpayers aren't in town. It's usually November and sometimes early April. And that's likely when most of the non-resident folks are not here. And that's when those warrant articles get proposed. And of course, we're not meeting. Maybe now might have the opportunity to actually form opinions on that because we might be able to meet virtually. But in the past, we've been a bit frustrated because these warrant articles are being offered and no one is considering whether we have views or not, and we can't speak at the town meeting, and we're not even on island for most of that. But anyway, I'm glad you hear what our concerns are. And let me ask some of the other folks who would like to have some questions asked. Lou, do you have any questions?
Now, let me start with a little statement that I think the non-voting taxpayers, which is the largest number of folks that are on the island, our concern is that we're paying most of the bill and we have no say in what's happening. And we probably are not going to have a say in the future. And the one thing that we're concerned about is we don't want to be taken advantage of. We want everything to be on an equal, fair basis, and we're willing to continue to pay our fair share, but we don't want to see some of the local folks, because they have the vote and we don't, them taking advantage of us. And I'm putting it right down at the bottom line as to where the problem can be. Either one of the two speakers could answer the following questions that I have. Concerned about the fund for uncollected taxes. We went through a pretty severe period of time where a lot of folks were out of work. And I'm wondering if that fund was depleted or how depleted it is, and have we still have enough money in that fund in the event that some folks can't pay their taxes, that money can be used to put back into the budget to balance the budget. That's the first question I have. Maybe somebody could answer that.
Before, I guess what I would ask, Lou, is I'm not sure what a fund for uncollected taxes is. Are you referring to the overlay, which is what we raise to, which basically offsets anyone who asks for abatement requests and things of that nature? Because the only thing that we have is we don't have a fund for uncollected taxes. Taxes, eventually we can lien the property, we can put it into tax title, and eventually we can sell the tax title if we choose, or we could go through the very arduous process, which we've never done in my tenure, of going through land court and foreclosing on the property and then taking possession of it and disposing of it.
What a lot of the municipalities do, they will take a certain amount of their budget and put that aside, 2.5%, 3%. Put that money aside. In the event that some folks don't pay their taxes, then go back to that fund, put that money back into the budget to make sure that the budget stays balanced. Then do what you said, go after folks either by putting a lien on their property or whatsoever. I'm assuming that the town has something like that, and I'm just wondering if that amount of money would have been depleted because of the hard times that we went through.
Well, we have we have probably about close to $30 million in reserves in the general fund alone, and that it has not been depleted. And I can tell you that historically, on a year-over-year basis, we have collected anywhere between 97.5% to 99% of the property taxes on a year-over-year basis before the end of June. And this year, we probably will end up collecting roughly about 93 to 94% of the taxes by June 30th, just because of the pandemic, but it's still well within the expectation. And for us, the majority of what will happen is it will impact us long-term more in cash flow than it will in revenue, because statutorily we will eventually collect all of that. So it's more, for us in the Commonwealth, it's more of a cash flow issue if we don't collect at that same level. But we had projected that we were going to collect less than the historical average that we had done when this pandemic hit, and we collected within the range that we thought we would. So I don't think we're going to face a severe crisis in terms of that at this point. Now, that's not to say if the pandemic, we have a massive resurgence and it happens all over again, that we won't be in a different position. But right now, I think that we are still okay. And we do have reserves that we could tap into if we needed to offset and mitigate that problem.
I appreciate that answer. And one other question that I have, our municipal budget, Is that reviewed by any state agency?
It's not reviewed by any state agencies in the Commonwealth. The budget goes through a intense review after it's done by the independent annual audit that we have, which those do typically sometimes get reported to the state, but there's no state agency that reviews the budget. The only review that a state agency would probably have on the budget would be when we're setting the tax rate. We have to stay within, the projected revenues, and if expenditures are over, it would force us to go back to a town meeting and cut the budget in order to be able to set the tax rate, because we have to have a balanced budget in order to set a tax rate. But as in terms of a formal review by a state agency, there is none.
Thank you.
Brian, you could also speak to the Moody's review to get the AAA rating, and all the work you always are doing with the Department of Revenue. So whilst there isn't one state agency that signs off, quote unquote, on the budget, there is definitely independent agencies reviewing the town's finances.
Yes,
I
that is
know
true.
what a AAA bond rating means
Yep, that's
to
great.
government, and you're to be.
I will note that we actually are the first island community to ever get it
Congratulations.
from
Peter,
Moody's.
you have questions, Peter? Peter? You're on mute.
Okay, I don't have any questions, just more of an observation. I pay real estate taxes in a number of places, and I must say that the tax rate in Nantucket is perhaps the lowest I have seen in any other place that I've paid it. So whatever you're doing, and with the review systems that you have, certainly as a taxpayer, a non-voting taxpayer, I'm kind of happy with the way things are going. I do have one question now that I think of it, and an observation with regard to the process that that Denice described. Is it correct that anybody, a non-voting taxpayer as well as a voting taxpayer, could address comments and concerns to your advisory committee at the time that you were making the up or down, or whatever the third consideration is? Because I think I have a recollection of having done so in the past.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, I'm sorry, Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, and as I recall, your predecessor, when we were last addressed, mentioned that if we, the problem we have is the warrants come out kind of late in the game, and as Gary said, we're not around, and sometimes it's hard to organize a group thought, but certainly it is possible once the warrant is published to see what seems to stick out like a sore thumb and address it. And my experience is if it sticks out like a sore thumb to me, it usually sticks out like a sore thumb to you as well. And then plus we can, for those in the committee, communicate with, I think, the moderator of the town meeting to have one's views made known or considered. And I certainly have done that in the past, as I think other members of the committee have done. So I'm sorry, that's kind of my non-question questions, but
So my non-answer to your non-questions is that all the finance committee meetings are public meetings. So, and now particularly with Zoom, because they're all on Zoom, you can easily register, you can easily attend them and ask questions. So if you're a member of the public, you don't have to be a voting member of the public to attend a finance committee meeting and to ask questions. And so the warrant, we start deliberating on warrant articles at the kind of the middle of December is our first pass. So the citizens warrant articles have to be in by, I think it's November 18th is the date. I don't have the calendar right in front of me. And then from there, we take a look at, the schedule, and we start right after New Year's and have 3 to 4 meetings a week. And what happened last year was, because there was so many citizen warrant articles, I invited each sponsor in and they spoke about it, et cetera. This year we've decided we'll be a bit more prescriptive in scheduling and be able to say, okay, on this night, we're going to talk about these 5 articles. because then that way it would also be helpful for people who want to participate on those particular articles to be able to ask questions. Because I understand that everybody doesn't want to come to every FinCom meeting, fascinating though I think they are. We tend not to get a lot of members of the public, usually a couple, unless it's something like gas power leaf blowers. Last year we got about 30 people in for that. So that was a exciting FinCom meeting. So yeah, so definitely you're able to attend all FinCom meetings and bring your point of view to us. And this year, so they're always posted on the town website, the agenda for the upcoming meeting. And this year we will be more explicit as to which ones we're talking about. So then that way you know if you want to dial in for that one or not.
Just one further observation, and it's sort of a plea for help if we need it. And that is, as Gary said, we have difficulty meeting off season other than when we have these Zoom meetings by emergency order. And I would hope when this emergency eventually goes away, I hope it does, that your committee as well as ours would support continued Zoom meetings so that, that even if you're collectively people who are not on island but have obviously a vested interest in the island can participate in the future.
Thank you for that. We'll have to take a look, Peter, as to how things unfold, obviously, as with everyone. And it is, you know, a lot of our stuff is actually dictated by the state or the Commonwealth. So, and because of the open meeting law, that has some restrictions in terms of how things can work. But I agree. I think it's, I have to say the Zoom meetings are good for things like this. Sometimes when you're trying to do deliberations or you're doing votes, you know, the roll call has to go name by name, and there's 9 of us on the FinCom. So is the agenda approved? Okay, 9 people, please say yes. So that takes a little bit more time. And at the same time, I do see benefits for doing things this way. So it's something that I can take into consideration and bring back to FinCom and town administration and select board and think about, is there something we can do that makes sense, that we can be able to have remote participation more easily. And I live right next to the hospital, so the background noise is now a helicopter. So, you know, it's action-packed at my house. I'm gonna need to build a bunker if we keep these meetings up this way.
Thanks.
Gary. I just, you know, certainly, I mean, my email and my phone number are on the town website, so anybody is always free to send me an email with any questions or pick up the phone and call me. I'm always available and always willing to talk and answer whatever questions that I can to help.
Thank you. Thank you. Don Green, do you have any questions for these folks?
Yes. I was wondering if employees, you say the budget sort of stayed the way it was before, but were employees furloughed, or were there people dismissed from their positions? And 2, I saw in the budget that changes in the health insurance led to significant savings, and I was wondering how that was accomplished.
Sure. So to answer your first question, through the pandemic, there were no furloughs or layoffs. Given the fact that we have the majority of the employees within the town are all union employees, there's significant processes and steps that have to be undertaken to do that. And in some instances, when you go through that process, it ends up costing you more in the short term than you would have otherwise. So we did not furlough anyone. As a matter of fact, the majority of the town employees, after I would say the first 2 or 3 weeks, once we got our feet underneath us and how we were going to deal with this and were able to leverage technology, we brought back a great majority of the employees working via remote work. So a lot of our employees, even through all of this, while the town offices were closed, were actually working remotely. It's one of the things that we made through some of the CARES Act money that we got. We made a significant investment in that, and in order to be able to keep people working and doing the job, because even with the pandemic, we didn't really, not a lot of operations within the town came to a complete halt. So we had to, you know, it took a couple weeks for us to kind of get how we were going to manage through this and what it was going to look like and what was going to happen. And then we ramped up very quickly in rolling out remote work for the majority of our employees through this. I will tell you that to answer your second question in the savings and health insurance, The majority of the savings in the revised budget are due to the elimination of the new positions that had been proposed and budgeted for in fiscal 21, apart from what was in the budget in fiscal 20, as well as a substantial amount of, we had a lot of vacant positions that were in the process or advertising, or we were working through what the position was going to look like. And we went through the entire list, and anything that wasn't deemed an absolute critical essential employee to continue the operations of the municipality, they were all defunded from fiscal 20 forward. So a lot of the health insurance savings for fiscal 21 are the result of the defunding of positions from 20 and carrying that defunding into 21. So that's where the majority of it was. We were also fairly lucky this year that our projected rate for fiscal 21 was less than we had originally anticipated in the budget. Our health insurance claim performed better than we had anticipated. And so that's primarily the two drivers for what changed in the final budget that was presented in June.
Thank you.
Peter Kahn?
Thank you, Gary. And first, I'd like to thank both of our guests. It's quite obvious that that you're doing a great job, and at obviously difficult times. And the simple fact of a AAA rating underscores that. And so I personally am appreciative. I suspect the rest of the committee is as well. I have two questions. The first, really a basic one, because I don't quite understand. On these enterprise funds, you break them down into basically two categories: those that are self-sufficient and those that apparently are not. The ones that are self-sufficient, like the airport, I assume that they are more than self-sufficient, that they are actually making money. What happens to that excess? Does it come back to the town, or does the airport sit on it?
So they perform in most normal times. They are certainly performing fairly well. The money stays within that fund. So what happens every year, the same with the free cash that the town, that's basically, in simplest terms, revenue over expenditures with some other machinations that the Commonwealth has us go through to come to that number. But within an enterprise fund is essentially the same thing. That is their year-end surplus or positive results. It's certified by the state. It stays within their operating fund themselves, and they are, once the state certifies it, it's effective for July 1st of whatever the new fiscal year is. So when we have the state come in after our audit is done, they will certify our free cash and the enterprise fund's retained earnings. They will be available for appropriation at any lawfully scheduled annual or special town meeting. Typically, what the enterprise funds and what the general fund we try to do is we allocate free cash or retained earnings to only one-time expenditures such as capital or things of that nature. We try not to. We have one fund that we actually have to. We try not to allocate that for anything that would be a permanent ongoing situation, because it's the variability in any fiscal year does not lend it to being a very fiscally sound practice to be allocating that for something that will continue long term. So any surplus that they create or certified retained earnings that they have stays within that fund. It does not come back to the town.
Okay, but that's something to consider, I guess, for long term. To the extent, for example, does the airport in good times, and this pandemic that got us once in 100 years kind of a thing. When you got get all these airlines coming in paying large fees, you've got the FAA putting money in. I assume that is a pretty healthy, if run properly, can be a pretty healthy fund.
Well, so the CARES Act money is obligated to be separated and segregated into a separate fund, so it won't impact their operation. They reduced their initial operating budget down because they had anticipated now substantial decrease in revenues. I think they're getting a little bit, their fuel is probably performing a little bit better than they had anticipated. They generally have had about anywhere between 1.7 and 2.5 million in retained earnings, depending on the year. And that money really is cycled through. And one thing that they do, the airport has a history, and we've agreed to this plan because of the way that they're doing it. They typically go to town meeting and ask for borrowing authorizations for the majority of their projects. And once those projects are done and certified retained earnings has been verified, they'll allocate money from that to pay what they would have normally borrowed as a way to mitigate paying principal and interest. And they use certified retained earnings a lot of times to pay their 10% or 5% portion of any projects that are funded by the FAA in conjunction with the Commonwealth. So they use a lot of it, again, not to fund any current actual long-term permanent operations, but to fund capital and their share of and things of that nature. So that it fluctuates on an annual basis. There were years when it was very low, and in the years that they perform well, they get the benefit of that, and then they can allocate it towards more capital, which ultimately reduces their borrowing costs, because they typically do a lot of borrowing authorizations for their projects.
Okay, thank you. My other question deals with the island home, and I guess going back to what Lou and Gary mentioned, of course, our concern is, is our representation at the annual meeting, and it's really, at least to me, it's that we don't have a say in the setting of the priorities, and so our island home and others are good examples of where the full-time residents get to tell you how, whether you can spend the money or not, and then through the finances, obviously, are setting priority.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious. I don't know enough about our island home, but I do know obviously it's expensive and that there are relatively few people involved. But I don't want to get into the social aspects of it. But I'm curious, when it obviously came to you first, the warrant came to you before it went to the voters. What position did you take on that? And is there, I'm curious whether has there been any attempt to outsource it and or to try to figure out a way to try to cut those costs, maybe continuing.
So it's a really good question. I will tell you that when we develop the budget, I don't take a position in either way in terms of island home. It's an operation that the town currently has that I need to work with the department to figure out how to fund it. Just like everything else, I don't really take a position either up or down on any single department or anything. We present to the town manager, and then the town manager presents to the select board. The whole premise behind the override really was simply because funding it the way we're doing is not the way to fund that operation. We need to have a permanent, I will say it this way, and this isn't a statement up or down against the island home. If we're going to continue to have the island home, then we have to fund it in a way that removes the difficulty and the uncertainty of how we're going to fund it and impact the general fund and all the other operations. It's reviewed like every other budget on an annual basis. So, it's right now there is, I think that the census is slightly higher than it's been in the past. I think it's closer to 38. And I think last year I might've been down around 34, 35. To your question about outsourcing, I think over the years it has been looked at, but it is, I think that there's complexities in operating nursing homes, and there's complexities and challenges in dealing with multitudes of various union contracts that may make it not something that many organizations would want to take on as an endeavor, I guess would be the way that I would say it. I mean, certainly there's a reason why we're the last municipality in the Commonwealth to be operating a nursing home, because it's just something that municipalities just, and that's not only just in Massachusetts, but across the country. Most municipalities have gotten out of operating nursing homes because they're complex and there's a lot of rules and regulations that you operate in. But the reality is that as of right now, we operate one, and it's my responsibility to find a way to fund it in the most sound way to continue the operations. And I'll continue to do that and make those recommendations until we're not in the business, I guess.
Peter, at our next meeting, we have Rachel coming, who's overseeing that, and I think we were able to ask her a lot more questions about our island home.
Yeah, I have just one question. I just have one follow-up, if I can, with Denice on that. I'm just curious what role the Finance Committee played in the approval or recommendation or non-recommendation.
Yeah, so Peter, thanks for that question. For our island home, we take the same position, frankly, as Brian, which is it being funded appropriately? So that's why when the override came in, you can use free cash for a one-of operating cost that unanticipated, but you shouldn't be using it year over year over year. Then you need to fund it appropriately. Secondly, there is actually an Our Island Home Working Group, which Rachel can talk to you about in great and gory detail the next time. I'm on that working group. We are looking at every possible option. And one of the things that I emphasize to people, Nantucket is an island that I often say votes its values, meaning the vote in favor of the override, frankly, was way more positive than I expected it to be. And whilst we might have a census of 35 or 38 people, you think about it times 5 or 6 or 8 family members. So it affects maybe 200, 250 people on the island. And the complexity comes from being on an island, right? So, and all the staffing issues that comes with how much redundancy you have to have, how much coverage you have to have, and not having a pool of people that might be able to drive from 30 miles away. So there's a lot of complexity to it. The town does take a lot of time looking at it, looking at options, and outsourcing has been discussed several times, and we're continuing to review it and continuing to say what's the best way forward. If the community has decided it's going to stay with having an island home, stay with having a nursing home, we're also, like a lot of communities, not many communities have an airport. So there's some things about Nantucket that, if you think about it, every town in the Commonwealth doesn't have an airport. So there's also things that are unique because Nantucket is an island and adds complexity and cost to it. So we do look at it. I'm on the working group, and Rachel she will be outstanding in having this discussion with you. That's all I can say.
Looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to that. Bill Sherman, do you have any questions? No? I don't hear it from Bill unless he's on mute. How about Bill Gardner?
I don't have any questions, but I'd like to say, as someone listening to a lot of this for the first time, how impressed I am with the financial talent that this town has.
Thank you, Bill. How about Kathy? No questions? My only last question to Denice is that when the Finance Committee reviews the warrant articles, does the Finance Committee review all of them or just the financial related ones?
Every single one, Gary. We review. So this year was 117 in total between the town-sponsored articles and the citizen-sponsored articles. So we review every single one. That's our charter. And whilst you might think that, well, why do you have to do that? Well, that's what our charter is as an advisory committee. And secondarily, almost everything in the end has a financial implication, right? So it might not have a direct cost in the moment, but it absolutely could have a financial implication somewhere down the line. So some things we can spend. I remember when I was first on FinCom, there was a article sponsored to say something about making noise 20 miles offshore or something. And I remember saying to David Worth, how do we enforce that? He goes, Denice, we're not going to have a Navy. This is just a sense of the meeting article. I'm like, okay, because I have a bias to action, right? So the minute something comes in front of us, I also want to know, well, how do we enforce it? Is it enforceable? Does it make sense? Because to make a law, if you can't enforce it, then I need to be persuaded as to why we're doing it. And so David just looked at me like, Denice, we're not going to be putting you in a boat running off, offshore for the next, okay. All right, David, I get it. So, but when I do actually have a question for this committee, and maybe it's more appropriately directed to Kathy. Kathy, if you would send me, because I know I should be able to just go out on the website and check when your next meeting is, but if you could give me a heads up about a week before, or if you already have a schedule of your meetings, I will try to attend as many of them as I can, understanding that, come the fall, I am having a lot of meetings with FinCom, getting ready for the annual town meeting next April. However, when I can, I will sign in, because that's the beauty of Zoom, is you can actually just be at home and quickly sign in, and so then that way I can hear more in real time some of the things that you've come up. And again, I'm not promising I'm going to be at every one, folks, so don't hold me to that. But now that we've had this introduction, I can try to be at more of them, if that would work. If you could do that for me, Kathy, that'd be great.
Yeah, we have 2 distribution lists, and actually the meeting notice goes out to the wider group. Basically, anyone who's ever shown any interest can get an invitation and
If you sent me that one. Okay, thank you, Kathy.
I can do that.
Thanks.
And it's also everything we do is posted on the town's website as well.
I know, and I should be more proactive in doing more pull versus push, but I tend to thrive better in a push environment than a pull. So,
Okay, good.
Well, I thank you both, Denise and Brian, for an enlightening and impressive presentations and response to all of our questions. I agree with what my colleagues have said, is you folks are doing a great job for all of us, the island, and for all of us taxpayers and residents and non-residents. So keep up the good work. And we thank you for joining us this morning.
thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
You
Thank you,
folks
everyone.
can stay on, or you can stay and continue listening, because the next subject we're going to talk about is a possible change or recommendation to the select board on the noise ordinance. I sent a note to the members of this committee. Kathy had received word from Libby. When Libby Gibson was our guest, one of the questions that we raised to her was, how do we control some of the noise problems on the island? And just last week or so, Libby was in receipt of several complaints from people on the island about very large amounts of construction projects that are creating noise. And Libby wrote back to us saying, would our committee be interested in a point of view? Do we have a point of view about it? So I sent a note around to all of our members, and what I got back was a couple of notes from some of our members, basically saying some of us are more concerned about construction noise, and that's because the current noise ordinance allows construction to begin every day from, I think, 8 o'clock in the morning to 10 at night, and on Sundays from 10 in the morning to 8 at night or something like that. And in residential areas, it's very oppressive, especially in very largely populated residential areas, because a lot of people who are here for the season, and they're not just renters, there are a lot of owners, taxpayers, who are seasonal residents, and they get here and they live next to a demolition project for 2 or 3 months. So that was one of the concerns our committee, some of our committee members had, and I'm one of those folks that have that concern. There were some of the people in town that were complaining about some projects up by Lincoln Circle that are major construction projects that are going 7 days a week as well. But a lot of our members talked about the noise from those gas-generated leaf blowers and other types of landscaping instruments. Kathy mentioned that, and even you, Denise, mentioned it was on a warrant issue, I guess, a possible warrant issue. So now I'd just like to open up the floor to our members and whoever would like to talk about whether you think that our committee ought to make some suggestions to Libby for the select boards to think about changing or changing the rules with respect to generally or just in high season, or what? Who would like to comment about that?
I'd like to comment.
Go ahead. Lou?
Mostly what you're talking about, noise from construction or reconstruction and from landscapers. I happen to be one of the people that lives near Tom Nevers Park, which is about a half a mile west of where I live. Kathy's probably familiar with this issue because it's been brought up at the Tom Nevers Civic Association in the past. With the creation of the park, we're getting some problems with noise. What has happened is that groups form over there. They take a SUV, put 2 large speakers in the back of that SUV, face it east, and then blast music while they're playing baseball or playing soccer. There have been a lot of events that were held in the past at Tom Nevers Park, Demolition Derby, the Island Fair. We used to have the carnival. none of them created the type of noise that we're getting from some of the folks that are over there abusing the system. There's a need, if we're going to start looking at noise, I would like to include into that suggestion, whatever we suggest, that we also look at Tom Nevers Park and the detrimental effect that we've had because people have, and I want to underline this, abusing the system.
Who else would like to talk? Comments? Peter?
For me, I guess for me, I'm sorry, Peter, Halle, did you want to go first?
Yes.
Okay.
I must say that I agree with what Lou just said because it dovetails with one of my suggestions, which is that we need a better definition and understanding of amplified noise. There are all kinds of things that people can do to listen to their amplified noise without having it intrude with others. One of the problems with this noise regulation that we have is that it does set up some decibel things where you go to section 101-4 and look at the noise tables. But it is it's an area of expertise to actually measure these noises. And I don't believe that our local police departments have the appropriate equipment that has been appropriately calibrated and all the rest of it to do it accurately. And so I think we need some better rules that maybe don't supplant these, but augment the rules so that people understand when they're making noise, what kind of noise they should not be making, so they can't, as Lou says, abuse the system. I don't know if they're abusing it or they're just not being considerate of people that live nearby or trying to have peace and quiet nearby. In addition to amplified noise, because I mean, we have it where I live, you have the park, we have a private club in the middle of a residential area. And they typically don't think about it when they have permitted events. And the tent permitting process, I think, needs to include noise regulations so that when the tent is put up and you have a band and all the rest of it, and you amplify all that, either the sides come down or the speakers are pointed in a way that they're not basically transmitting an overabundance of noise outside. Lastly, and I'll stop with this one, is that we also have a problem with the growing density on the island. People are living closer to each other, and we have all kinds of mechanical equipment that operates 24/7, basically 365 days a year, including pool pumps, maybe not in the wintertime, but certainly during the season, air conditioners, whether they be for cooling the air or heating the air. And there are decibel, you pay a little bit more, you get a little bit quieter machinery. But where you have, as I think Kathy mentioned, 10-foot setbacks from house to house on either side, putting the least expensive, noisiest air conditioning and pool pumps in those areas, I think is not conducive to public peace and quiet, and that we ought to have regulations that basically try to figure out either where you put these kinds of noisemakers or how you quiet them down, because all that technology is there, so that you don't have to listen to your neighbor's pool pump grinding away or your neighbor's air conditioning and vice versa. So that's my 4 cents.
Peter Kahn.
Yes, thank you. I think that this problem, quote unquote problem, will never be resolved unless the town is prepared to deal with enforcement. You can have all the rules you want, and as we've seen, and I think we have, the rules arguably are in place now, but unless you have an enforcement mechanism, nothing's going to happen. So there has to be buy-in that there's going to be, whether it's the police or some other, whether it's some other department that actually goes around and starts enforcing some of this. And I think once you start enforcing it, that will send the message very loud and clear. It's almost like dealing with your kids, you know, until you actually hand out a little punishment, they'll go as far as they can go. The second side of this is that the separate issue, it seems to me, is the issue of construction. You know, it's kind of ironic, you know, we're saying, oh, all the laborers and whatever, you know, they're the ones who are making the noise. But of course, we, as the non-voting taxpayers, we're the ones who are primarily doing the building. I mean, it's our money that's going to fund these construction projects. And we're the ones, or at least the new people coming in, are the ones who want this, who want to build here, and of course, paying the taxes, what have you. I feel that a 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, during the season is a reasonable requirement. I think it's a matter of enforcement. It's a matter of getting people out there to enforce that. I think that could be done. So I think those two could go a long way in helping solve this problem.
Any other comments? I have one myself. Don?
Yeah, I agree. This is a very hard problem to enforce. I mean, you push in one place and it's going to bulge out somewhere else. For my daughter's wedding, we had it on an outside lawn, a big tent. There was a band and lots of people. But what we did before the event took place was go to all our neighbors and tell them what is happening. So I think there's a more civil way to handle this than through regulation. I think people have to interact more with each other, and so that peace and civility is kept. Having enforcement always is going to build some resentment. So, and the noises, I don't know, where I live now, a train goes by and they're building new units. Unfortunately, closing the door takes out the noise. But they are keenly aware of no one is playing loud music or anything of that sort. So it's only once in a while the decibel level rises. So I'm more for a neighborly interactive kind of approach to the problem. Getting out, speaking to people, saying what your concerns are, and usually they'll respond.
Okay. As I mentioned to some of you folks, very early in the season, I think in one of the first notes that I sent out, my own personal view, of course, which probably will never be adopted by the island of Nantucket, in my Florida community, where we end up for a few months at the end of the year and in the early spring, there is no construction permitted between December 1st and April 15th. And everyone knows that, and all the real estate brokers know that. When they sell somebody a home or even a lot, people are going to build on it. They know they can't start construction until April 15th, and they have to stop by December 1st. And the only major construction that is permitted during that period is emergency repairs. And knowing the importance to the real estate industry of that kind of activity on the island, I think it would be very hard for us to get the town to accept that, even if the select board agreed that we the people funding most of the budget for the entire town really want it to happen. You know, the voters, the small group of voters that actually show up for annual town meetings may not likely approve something like that. So then that's why in the note that I sent around, Bill, you have a comment, Bill? Oh, okay. Anyway, so the note that I sent around said, well, maybe at least if they change the regulations so that at least during the high season in Nantucket, I forget what those dates are, I put it in the note there, at least up till, you know, I think some point in June to September 15th, at least the heavy construction would only be permitted between, you know, 9 and 5 days a week, so that people could at least treasure the quiet, relatively quiet during the weekends. How do you folks feel about that? Is that something that you think, I mean, that's what Peter Kahn mentioned as well. Is that something we might try to recommend?
I personally would like to see a committee formed, not necessarily from our committee, but a committee formed by the selectmen to look at this whole noise issue and to revise the existing statutes that we have on the books. Because it not only is construction, as I said earlier, we have the problem here with the park. And it ties into something that we talked about not too long ago, and that was rental properties. A lot of the rental properties are rented for a weekend and they hold weddings, they put tents up. Other problems that come from that, one of them happens to be noise. So maybe looking at this whole issue, maybe a way of coming up with a proposal for the selectmen to consider in adapting a new ordinance.
Peter?
Yeah, it's not, I mean, it's a complicated issue, obviously. You know, it sounds great to be able to sort of block off time when you can't do any construction, but you know, this island is primarily made up of contractors of one sort or another, and to deprive them of their livelihood is tough. I mean, you know, very tough. And now, arguably, you know, you can probably do interior work and what have you, but that's, you know, not so easy. And a lot of this noise, I think Kathy is the one who brought it up, is actually tied to landscape work in one form or another. That's going to go on no matter what you do. I guess you know, I'm not a big one on committees for everything, but I guess this is worthy of some study before we sort of try to impose an overriding solution. I think that, again, I come back to the enforcement. I don't disagree with Don. Obviously, for weddings and what have you, you know, the first thing you should do is talk to your neighbors. But for you know, audio sound, I think, you know, it's very, you know, it's on the books. You know, you go to, if somebody's making noise in the park with their boom boxes, you know, you ought to call the police and get them out there to enforce it, or whoever it is. And I think once we start enforcing that stuff, I think a lot of it will become it'll drop.
I just want to add a comment to what you just said through the chair. What you said makes some sense, but to get police out here 2.5 hours because they tell you that they're tied up with more important problems in town. They also tell you that there's an ordinance that people are allowed to do what they're doing up until 10 o'clock at night. I mean, I can't sit on my porch a half a mile from where the noise is because their trees are low and those amplifiers that they put in the back of their vehicles blast the sound a mile from where it originates from. So I think that there's a need to look at total ordinance and the problems of sound from all different types that are taking place on the island. I know that it can be controlled because we had so many events at the Tom Nevers Park from different groups, and they were never loud the way we're having the problem now.
Bill Sherman here. I'd like to move that we instruct the chairman of our committee to write a letter to the select board recommending that they establish an ad hoc committee to look at the issue of noise on island and determine whether changes in regulation, enforcement, or public information programs would address the various issues that have been raised.
Second.
Yeah, and I move to make one amendment, if I may,
Sure.
if it's appropriate at this point. I think that perhaps one or more members of this committee should be, or I don't know how you put it to the select board, but it would be good if one or more members of our committee were appointed to that committee.
As long as it's
I can put that in the letter. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Amendment's accepted.
Bill always comes up with a good idea. We had a motion and it's been amended. Is there a second?
Second.
Let's take a vote. Kathy, voting. I'm for it. Lou?
Yes.
Bill Gardner? Peter Hale?
Yes.
Don,
Yes.
and Peter?
Yes.
Okay, we got it. Very good. Thank you so much, Bill. Always helping with our procedures.
Bye.
Any other comments or thoughts? No, if not, I'd like all of you to enjoy the rest of the Labor Day weekend. Make sure you wear your masks and stay safe. And our next meeting, I have one other thought, by the way. Our next meeting is 3 weeks from now. And Kathy and I were thinking maybe, so long as we're going to be able to continue to have these virtual meetings, maybe we don't have to have them every 2 weeks. Maybe we ought to schedule them every 3 weeks. That's what Kathy was suggesting to me. And I think either 3 weeks, I don't know if once a month is something we should do off season or schedule for 3 weeks. What do you, anybody have any thoughts?
When's the next one? The 26th?
Yeah, next one is the 26th and we don't
I
have.
have to send an update out for that because we had it on the 19th and we agreed to make the 26th and I need to send out an update. So if you have it in your calendar right now.
Right, the next meeting is going to be the 26th. And then the quick, yes, Don?
Why don't we put it on the agenda for the next meeting,
Okay,
since we're at the end of this one?
great idea. So one of the agenda items, Kathy, for our next meeting will be talking about the winter meeting schedule of the Advisory Committee for Non-Voting Taxpayers.
Right, and right now we have no, we're not going to be contacting any potential speakers until after our next meeting, right?
Yes,
Okay,
so we'll have 3 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks at least. to
Okay.
book somebody, Melissa Murphy or somebody like that. All right, if no other business, once again, I want you to all have a good weekend and stay safe. Motion to adjourn,
So moved.
all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks
Thank-
again, Denise. Bye-bye. Thank you, Kathy.
thank you.